Once upon a time, there was a wicked witch. The wicked witch had a magic mirror that she would ask every morning, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror then replies, "My queen, you are the fairest in the land." The queen is always pleased to hear this. But there was one problem. There was this one girl named Snow White. But as Snow White grows up, she becomes more beautiful every day, and even more beautiful than the queen. And when the queen asks the mirror, it tells her that Snow White is now the fairest. And this isn't pleasing to the queen because the mirror never lies. It is then that the queen becomes envious and goes into great shock, and from that moment on, her heart turns against Snow White, whom the queen grows to hate increasingly with time. One day, the angry queen then orders a huntsman to take Snow White into the deepest part of the woods to be killed. As proof that Snow White is dead, the queen then demands he returns with her lungs and her liver. The huntsman takes Snow White into the forest. After raising his knife, he finds himself unable to kill her, and spares her life. He then tells Snow White that her stepmother wants her dead. He then orders her to flee as far away from the kingdom as possible. He instead brings the queen the heart of a wild animal. As Snow White wanders through the forest, she then discovers a tiny cottage belonging to a group of 7 dwarfs. Since no one is home, she eats some of their tiny meals, drinks some of their tiny wine, and then tests all of their beds. Finally, the last bed is comfy enough, and then she falls asleep. When the dwarfs return home, they immediately become aware that someone has snuck in secretly, because everything in their home is in disorder. During their loud discussion about who snuck in, they discover that Snow White sleeping. She wakes up and explains to them what happened, and the dwarves take pity on her and let her stay with them in exchange for housekeeping. They warn her to be careful when alone at the house, and to let no one in when they are away climbing up the mountains. Meanwhile, back at her castle, the queen asks the mirror once again, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror replies, "My queen, you are the fairest here, so true. But Snow White, beyond the mountains, at the 7 dwarves, is 1,000 times more beautiful than you." The queen is horrified to learn that the huntsman has betrayed her and that Snow White is still alive. Planning to kill Snow White, the queen disguises herself as an old peddler. The queen appears at the dwarf's cottage and offers Snow White a colorful, silky piece of clothing and convinces Snow White to take the most beautiful clothing as a present. Then the queen laces up her tightly, and that Snow White faints, causing the queen to leave her for dead. But it is then that the dwarves return in time, and Snow White revives when the dwarfs loosen her laces. The queen then goes back to the magic mirror, and the mirror reveals how Snow White survived. The queen dresses as a comb seller and convinces Snow White to take a beautiful comb as a present. She brushes Snow White's hair with the poisoned comb, and the girl faints again. Snow White is then revived again by the dwarves as they remove the comb from her hair. When the mirror again indicates that Snow White is still alive, the queen makes a third and final attempt on Snow White by disguising herself as a farmer's wife and offering a poisoned apple to her. The girl is at first hesitant to accept it, so the queen cuts the apple in half, eating the part of the apple that has not been poisoned and giving the red poisoned half to Snow White. The girl eagerly takes a bite and falls into a state of emission. At this time, the dwarves are unable to revive Snow White. Assuming that she is dead, she is placed in a glass casket. After a short period of time, a prince traveling through the land sees Snow White. He strides to her coffin. Enchanted by her beauty, he instantly falls in love with her. The 7 dwarves come running to him and tell him what happened to Snow White. The moment he lifts the coffin to carry it away, a piece of a poisoned apple falls from between her lips, and Snow White awakens saying, "Where am I?" The prince then declares his love for her, and soon a wedding is planned. Snow White and the prince invite everyone to come to their wedding party, including Snow White's stepmother. Meanwhile, the queen, still believing that Snow White is dead, again asks her magic mirror who is the fairest of them all. The mirror then replies, "Thou, lady, art loveliest here, I ween, but lovelier far is the new-made queen." This enrages the queen. Not knowing that the prince's bride is her stepdaughter, the queen arrives at the wedding and sees the bride is Snow White, whom she thought was dead. She chokes with rage, falls down, and dies. Snow White and the prince regain happily over the land for many, many years, and sometimes traveling into the mountains and visiting the dwarves, who had been so kind to Snow White. The end. The target audience that I am trying to go for is mainly teenagers to young adults.